A warning. We talk about some heavy topics, including murder and other acts of violence. Listener discretion is advised. Previously on She Has a Name. In the summer of 1987, 14-year-old Antonio asked his mom, Anita, if he could sleep over at his cousin's house for the weekend.
She was like, yeah, it's fine. But then, kind of gave me the talk before I left.
What was the talk?
How she loves me and, we all we got.
That was the last time Antonio saw his mother. And for 3 decades, he's been haunted by the unknown and driven by the need to find answers. What happened to Anita?
After my mother died, it was just a whole different world. And thank God Anita was so advanced. The streets knew about drugs, and she knew good people. Even though they were drug dealers, they were good people, and they took care of her.
None of us kind of liked him, but she loved him. But when looking back now, that was the point of tension.
In the search to find out what happened to his mother, Antonio found me and revealed that Anita was a sister I never knew existed.
What were you searching for when you contacted me?
My aunt, you know? And it was just crazy because the more I realized who you were, the more I just knew, that you knew who I was. If we could get to that level of conversation, that we probably would both discover something new.
I did not find Anita. I want to make that very clear. Antonio never stopped looking, and he did everything that he could possibly do on his side. And because of his determination, he is the reason that Anita is now not in an unmarked gravesite. And she is not now known as Unknown Woman 1987. She has a name.
The first outward signs that something was wrong in Antonio's life were the nosebleeds. For weeks after his mother disappeared, he'd sit in his 7th grade class, obsessively going over plausible reasons why his mom was MIA, when all of a sudden, he'd feel the gush of blood pouring from his nose.
I just remember, my teachers accusing me of snorting coke and shit. And, collaring me up in the hallway, tell the truth. Tell the truth. And I'm like, I don't do drugs,
And you're dealing with so much at home, and they don't even know.
They ain't even know.
The drug thing he set them straight about, but he never let them know that his life was spiraling out of control. He never said to them, look, I need help. I don't know where my mom is. In part because he was confused himself. How was he going to tell these teachers, who were already suspicious of him, who saw the silence and sadness in his eyes as guilt, that something he couldn't explain had happened to his mother? How would they interpret it all? Would they be suspicious of her too? Also, there was something else. While Anita wasn't home, she was in touch.
What would your mother say to you on those phone calls?
It was very brief. She would just assure me she was okay. She'll be home soon, So it was almost as if, I wouldn't dare say it was scripted, but I think it was to some degree. Or there was some level of just caution on her end, as not to say too much, I guess.
Antonio was paralyzed with fear. What the hell was going on? The calls were always in the late afternoon, and from what he can recall, they lasted no more than 5 minutes. And no matter how many times he asked, Antonio says his mom would never reveal where she was or when she'd be home.
What was going through your mind? Do you remember asking her questions?
Yeah, I would try to keep her on the phone, just ask anything I could think of, whatever came to mind at that point, just to keep her talking, and the line would just go dead.
Now, every time Antonio shares this part of the story with me, I try to put myself in his shoes. It's easy to say what I would do, how I'd be yelling from the rooftops about it all. But given what Antonio and Anita's lives had been like up until this point, it makes sense. The years leading up to this moment were rough. Only a year before, Antonio was living with his step-grandparents, longing for the day when he and his mother could live under the same roof. And then there was that stint in the shelter. Antonio was finally feeling safe and secure with his mother. And now this. Was it like her to be gone for days at a time? Was that something that was normal and her calling you to check in?
I mean, she didn't need a hall pass, I guess, to be an adult, but typically if she's going to be out for the evening, she would at least tell me that.
The truth is, Anita was also struggling with addiction, and Antonio knew it. So that meant he definitely wasn't going to call the police. And Aunt Val and Uncle Frank, he thought, lived too far away in Cleveland to do anything. The only other people he could think of were his step-grandparents, Leo and Linda, but they were on the outs with Anita. As you remember, the last time he saw them, Linda had given Anita an ultimatum about her lifestyle before dropping them off at the shelter.
I didn't want to call my grandfather because they'd already kind of parted ways with me and my mom at that point. So I didn't know if they even cared. You know what I'm saying?
So it made perfect sense to Antonio to just avoid it all, to go about life like nothing was wrong. And besides, what if he was making a big deal out of nothing? What if all of a sudden Anita walked through that front door? Antonio was in turmoil. And as the summer turned to fall, he tried to put up a good front. In the mornings, he'd get himself ready and off to school. He'd cook his own dinner and get himself ready for bed, rinse and repeat. And just like Anita had done a decade before, when she suddenly lost her mother as a teenager, Antonio had to figure out how to support himself. As money got tight, he started selling what he could for food.
Mixtapes, bus transfers, anything I can get my hands on,
Antonio can't quite say for sure, but he thinks Anita called him about half a dozen times. At first, the calls would come once every few days, then once a week, before stopping altogether. Even then, Antonio didn't rush to tell anyone until their phone got cut off. That landline was literally the only connection he had to his mother. Now, Anita couldn't get a hold of him, even if she tried.
So I needed a fresh set of eyes on the situation, I guess you could say. And my dad at the time was the only person I can think of that I can really maybe tell the truth about the situation to.
Calling his father Stephen was almost like calling a stranger. They'd see each other on holidays and birthdays, maybe a weekend here or there. They really didn't know each other. None of that mattered at this point, though. Stephen was Antonio's only lifeline.
I just kind of scrounged up some change and decided, at the time, I just kind of kept a little phone log of numbers. So I had people's numbers written down, and I just kind of grabbed that and threw my jacket on and just walked out. And I just remember it was so cold out there.
In search of a payphone, Antonio braved the weather. There was a bite in the air that signaled winter wasn't too far away. Antonio estimates that his mother had been missing for about 2, maybe 3 months by then.
It was like freezing rain, and almost turned around, went back in. I was like, oh man, it's cold. But then I said, nah, I got to get out of here. So I toughed it out and walked down to the corner, Chicago Boulevard and Dexter. There was a payphone maybe a block over.
Using the last of his change, Antonio called Stephen and said the words he'd been afraid to say for months. He was scared. His mother, Anita, was missing.
I told my wife that Tony's mom ain't been around, so we're going to move him on in. So we started making room for him until his mom showed back up.
Yeah.
Because I know that wasn't like her to be leaving him there like that.
When did you start getting worried?
Well, I was worried once I moved him in. That's why I said, we try to get some kind of normalization in his life
Antonio was now living with his father, but there was no moving on, no back to normal. In fact, nothing, Antonio says, would ever feel normal again.
Nobody would ever take care of me again. Like, even though I was a kid still, I didn't foresee nobody washing my laundry or, getting me back in school or even paying for my college.
What does a wounded boy hold on to when his mother is gone? The ways she taught him to survive, and the creation of falsehoods, omissions, and a version of the truth he's created to make it through each day. I'm Tonya Mosley. This is She Has a Name, Episode 5, The Guy from Detroit. What you just heard about a scared and confused Antonio living alone for months in their apartment, getting weird out-of-character phone calls from Anita, selling bus tickets for food, scrounging up change to call his dad out of desperation. For decades, Antonio intentionally never told anyone about those details, or really anything about his mother.
You're the first person I kind of began to actually talk to about these things, and without you making it about you.
Antonio told me recently that so much of what he shared with me over the years, and for this podcast, he's never shared with anyone else. Now, I've come to believe the reason why is that I am safe to Antonio. Because while Anita was my sister, I never met her, so I'm invested enough to care, but distant enough not to be caught up in my own grief about her loss. I also think that now that Antonio is in his 50s, he's just ready for people to know, to face painful truths, to lighten a heavy load that he's been carrying around for so long. I know all of this now, but it took me a while to figure it out, in part because Antonio is also so good-natured and easy to talk to. His resting face is a warm smile, which gives off the impression that he's an open book, when really, what he does is open up space for you. You can have a whole entire conversation with him, only to later realize that he's revealed very little about himself. Antonio's good friend Patrick just realized this recently, too. The two of them met in college at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, in the early 2000s.
He was always further than us. It seemed like he had experienced life in a way that he was able to kind of connect the dots.
Antonio was around 26 years old, older than the average college student. And during those years, Patrick, Antonio, and a group of other students would have what they called a meeting of the mind gathering, where they'd chat over coffee about everything from art to culture and politics.
Antonio always seemed like he had kind of this deeper level of understanding about how everything kind of connected. I get it now, but I remember him having these deep conversations where, I was more focused on trying to figure out how to get through my calculus class, and he was kind of taking it up a notch and connecting it to these different dynamics of life.
Patrick first experienced the depths of their friendship around Christmas time in 2010. Patrick's mother was in the hospital battling cancer, and he'd share with Antonio the enormity of it all. And Antonio would listen in silence, with kind and knowing eyes.
It's kind of like the quote of Maya Angelou that you don't remember what people said or what they've done, but you remember how they made you feel. So I remember feeling that this is a dude who gets me.
About a week before Christmas, Antonio called Patrick and invited him to Congressman John Conyers' holiday party in Detroit. Conyers was the longest-serving Black congressman in U.S. history before his death in 2019 and a legend in the city. Everybody has a story about him, including myself. So it was a big deal to be invited to one of his Christmas parties. Patrick remembers walking into the party with Antonio, who was in his element, introducing Patrick to people, joking and making small talk. The two chatted up with the who's who of Detroit as they pushed their way through the crowd to meet the man of the hour, Congressman Conyers, who was sitting in the middle of the room.
Certainly in the moment that he saw Antonio, he lit up and made it easy for me to have a conversation because he had warmed, that dialogue and prepared that. So
this was him getting me away from my circumstances. So even in this moment, he was getting me away from what I was dealing with. My mom was in the hospital dealing with cancer, and she had been in there for a month at that time, and she would be gone 3 weeks later. And so got to get a break from dealing with hospitals to get living some life.
There's a moment for everyone who loves Antonio when they realize his open generosity really only extends outward. He allows space for those around him to share their grief. But when it comes to conversation about his own pain and sorrow, it's a one-way street. Patrick knew very little about Antonio's life before college.
He felt like you were there for him at a time when he really needed you to be.
Yeah.
The thing, though, that he felt is that he just had no idea what you had been through.
I know. And I kind of feel bad about, not laying all my cards out on the table, so to speak, but I don't think that was the time for that. He needed what he needed, and that was authenticity. He needed people in his corner.
You never told him, though.
Nope. I did not.
How come?
I just never led with that in conversation at all with anyone. Because, when people associate traumatic events like that with you, then that's what their mind goes to. And it makes it hard for them to focus on anything else, you see. So in order for us to continue to have our mastermind alliances, to network and, be outgoing and innovative as a crew, as friends. I knew they weren't in a place and space in their life to really, digest what I'd already had gone through. It wasn't until, like in Pat's situation in particular that, he had to deal with the loss of his mom and things like that, that I felt like, in a way, he was going through something similar. And I just wanted to support him there because I knew most people wouldn't understand what that's like.
I recently read a book by licensed psychologist and author Dr. Robin L. Smith called The Invisible Ache: Black Men Identifying Their Pain and Reclaiming Their Power. And in it, Dr. Robin and actor Courtney B. Vance explore the very truth that Black men often have a hard time expressing their emotional struggles, which increases their likelihood of depression and suicide. Antonio says this way of moving through the world, of sharing on a need-to-know basis on just about everything, started when his mother disappeared in '87, when he went to live with his father, Stephen. In a matter of months, a 14-year-old Antonio had gone from the world he and his mother shared to somebody else's reality. Stephen was 28 and building a new life for himself. He'd recently gotten married, his wife was pregnant, they'd just bought a new house, and he had landed a good job working as a dye setter with Ford. Compared to the life he shared with his mom, Antonio considered his dad a square. All they needed was a white picket fence, Antonio thought, which made him feel like even more of an outsider in his father's life. I asked Stephen how aware he was at the time that Antonio was struggling and how difficult it must have been for everybody.
He has fond memories of staying with you, but he also said he felt like he was kind of imposing because you had this new family. You were starting this new life, and he was kind of the third wheel or the extra wheel.
No, he wasn't no burden. But, I don't know how he felt. You know what I'm saying? No, he wasn't no burden to me, because, all I wanted him to do was go to school, get his education, That's all he had to do for me. And we'd go from there. I told him, I'll get you a job. You just go and finish school. I'll get you in.
But Antonio couldn't think about school and this imagined future where he'd work alongside his dad at Ford. His mother was missing. And he knows this wasn't intentional, but living with his dad and the new family he'd created almost felt like he was being asked to pretend like his mother never existed. There was one moment that Antonio remembers as a turning point. You had a memory recently unlocked. The first time you remember crying, really crying about your mom's disappearance. It was at your dad and stepmom's house. By then you were living with them, and she asked you to go to the store.
Yeah. It's so interesting how, when I think about it, it seems like as if it was a long length of time, but it really wasn't. So from that initial phone call to going to stay with them, went into the spring months, I guess you can say, was, kind of upon us. And she was learning how to cook. They were newlyweds, right? She was trying some recipes or whatever and was short on an ingredient or two and asked me to run down to the local store, which was an In-N-Out. Got her order and went on my way. It was a long walk, I'll say that. But I made it, I got there, got what she needed. But then on the walk home, something just kind of came over me, just kind of really started missing my mom. And couldn't make sense of anything at that point in time. And, just the tragedy of it all just really just started to break my heart in that moment, and I just remember in spite of myself, beginning to cry and just really couldn't stop. So, it was a parish right there, kind of took up the whole block. And I just kind of hung out there in front of the parish for a while, just kind of pacing, trying to shake it off. But nothing I did could quell that feeling. It was pretty intense.
When Antonio got back to the house, his stepmom was standing on the porch waiting for him. She wanted to know why it took him over an hour to get back from a trip that should have only taken about 20 minutes.
First thing, she you got people worried about you, that kind of thing. But then I think she looked at me and she came and sat next to me and, threw her arm around me and pulled me close. Told me, everything was going to be all right.
That was kind of the first time someone had done that for you since your mom had disappeared.
It was. It really was. And the first time I'd even ever heard those words, you know what I mean? Which kind of crazy to think about now.
He heard his stepmother's words and even felt the warmth of her embrace. But by then, Antonio had already placed a barrier between his heart and those who were trying to love and support him. All he wanted was his mother.
I couldn't go back to playing with Legos at that point in my life. Things just really got real. So, with tragedy and heartbreak and things like that, now starting to bleed into my everyday, I had to protect my heart a little bit. You know what I mean? I couldn't let those dark clouds consume me.
That was the last time Antonio remembers crying as a young man. He wouldn't cry again until he was 47 years old. The day he received the phone call in February of 2020 that his mother's remains had been found. Antonio was alone in this world without his mother, and no one would ever really be allowed in until he found her.
Did you feel cared for and secure? Did you feel secure there?
I don't think I've ever felt that way since my mom passed, to be honest with you. Even to this day, I think that's something I create. It's like culture. It's something that I create in my own life.
Security.
Days. Everything. Everything.
Around 1988, a year after Anita disappeared, Antonio decided he didn't want to live with his dad anymore. So he moved to Cleveland to live with his Aunt Val and Uncle Frank. The scared and innocent boy he was before his mother vanished was long gone. Now he was 16, a young man in the eyes of the world, which meant he needed to figure out how he was going to support himself after high school. He remembers how all of this came together for him right before he left Detroit for Cleveland, as he watched one of his cousins prepare for college.
You know, me and my cousin, we're like a year apart or whatever, and I can remember them like prepping him to go on college tours and things like that, and talking about, you know, student housing for him and going to, you know, tuition out of state. And, you know, when it came to me, it was crickets. As far as I was concerned, after 12th grade, I was out the house anyway. Like, nobody was going to sponsor me.
You felt like you had to be there for yourself, right?
Absolutely. I had to pay I had to come up.
Did you ever feel angry about it, that you didn't have anybody there?
I was a little disappointed more than anything. But at the same token, my mother always told me, like, God bless the child who has his own. Like, don't depend on the generosity of others. You know, if you want something in life, you get it. You know, and you don't have to be a sleazebag to do that. Use your brain, use your intelligence.
So at 16, Antonio moved in with his Aunt Val and Uncle Frank in Cleveland. And after a few weeks of being there, news got out that there was a guy from Detroit on the block. One day, while sitting on his Aunt Val's porch, a neighbor came over with a proposition.
He came to me and was just basically like, you know, I got a lot going on. I don't really have anybody I can trust. I need you to just keep money for me. So that's kind of how it started. So I would, you know, basically keep money and start doing the books. Because I was doing the books, he would ask me to come with him when he would go meet with his suppliers.
The guy was a drug dealer, and Antonio says he didn't want to be a sleazebag, as he put it, but he needed money, and this seemed like a simple way to make a lot in a short amount of time. Val and Frank had opened their home to him, which he was thankful for, but they were just getting by themselves. They wouldn't be able to help him go to college or hold him down after high school. Plus, he knew this world from his mother. She taught him how to count, sort, and store large sums of cash. And so while he didn't want to do this forever, he thought the gig of holding a drug dealer's funds was a good low-stakes option to create his own way.
2.5 mil was my exit strategy. And that's just because I thought to myself, if I can get compound interest on 2.5 billion at 9%, I will have enough to become an adult with, you know?
And live.
Yeah.
Maybe it comes as no surprise by now that Antonio never shared any of this with me over the years. The conversation you just heard was after Aunt Val and Uncle Frank told us about what Antonio was into, how he got caught up and went to prison before he could make that 2.5 mil.
He went to prison, you know what I'm saying?
He just deviated. He just a kid, you know, because he was a hustler, you know, and everybody knew him as the guy from Detroit, you know.
None of this is really shocking to me. I know a lot of people who have gotten caught up. Some have done their time and are living better lives on the other side. What stung for me at first, before I understood the depths of Antonio's trauma, is that he had me learn about all of this on my own. During the making of this podcast, I'd asked him about the Cleveland years, and he'd only give me vague details. We'd known each other for close to 20 years at this point. He let me find out, though, by talking to Val and Frank.
You never let on to me that you know this life.
Yeah.
Why?
I guess I've seen so much of it. I won't say something that I'd rather forget, but I've seen both sides of it, you know. I've seen the destruction, you know, and I've seen the opportunity.
Antonio, at 20 years old, received a 15-year sentence on drug trafficking charges. He served a total of 6 years. This was Antonio's first and only offense. He sometimes thinks back to something his attorney said to him on the day of his sentencing.
You know, I remember my lawyer, he was like, he says, you know, he tells the judge something like, yeah, he says,
Antonio's a brilliant guy. He just didn't have good role models. And I just kind of looked at him. I was actually kind of offended, when he said that,
Why?
I didn't think it was his place to say something like that. I didn't think he really knew what it was like to grow up in Detroit and an urban area. He went to law school with the judge, right? His dad was a judge. These guys live in condos and, gilded communities. And
you feel like he didn't understand really where you came from and what you had gone through to be in that moment.
Exactly. Or who, even who my role models are,
But now that you're a man, and you look back, do you see a little bit of truth in it?
Absolutely. I had to really meditate on that, But it just kind of took me by surprise when he said that. In my defense, though, because I was wondering what is it that he does see in me that maybe I'm overlooking,
Antonio had never considered that all he'd seen before that moment, the way his mother hustled, the way he saw others hustle, as anything more than a means for survival. The idea of role models had never crossed his mind.
When I got indicted, and I was a kid, whatever, up to that point, it was nothing but adults that made decisions in my life. And I just remember thinking like, wow, like I never thought I'd be in this type of situation, And I really didn't have a response. And that frustrated me. But I remember I got a hold to a chessboard and I just laid it out and I would play chess against myself. And it changed my thinking a little bit. It changed my approach to problem solving, I guess you can say. So it became an exercise more of problem solving. And within that construct, that's how I approached that situation. It was just a problem to be solved.
What were some things or some resolve that you made for yourself, or promises, if anything, you made for yourself while you were locked up?
Well, just to kind of, figure out a different path for myself in life, to kind of, pick back up on my studies and just try to figure out a different approach.
Prison changed him.
How so?
He started to make sense. He went to school, got his education, became interested in life.
Prison was like an intervention. While locked up, Antonio got his GED. And when he got out, he moved back to Detroit, enrolled in college, and soon after found me. It's a classic redemption story, and also a cautionary tale. Because while Antonio's playbook for keeping things close to his chest, presenting as if everything is fine, it served him, but it's also come at a cost to his relationships with his friends and his partner and his children. And now that almost everything is out in the open, his own troubles, the mysterious way his mother disappeared, and the horrendous way she was murdered, we're all asking ourselves, what's next?
And so now that she's found, it's like a new day. It's like another now reorienting of your relationships with people.
Sorta, but it still bothers me. It really does, because I know that my mom's situation is indicative of a bigger problem. So I don't know,
Also, do you feel like you need to find out what happened and who did this to her?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Next time on She Has a Name, in November of 1987, firefighters responded to an overnight house fire, and inside, they found Anita.
When the fire department responded there was human remains inside, and there was obviously burned tissue.
Anita was brutally murdered, the crime covered up by a house fire. How did she end up there? We walk through the family's theories and the police investigation.
So this is a Dr. Hicks appointment.
And see, it didn't make sense to me now, but I told you, the Sergeant Jones said that she was pregnant when she was murdered. So this is a doctor's appointment, 9th floor, Dr. Hicks, appointment 1:30, March 30th.
But you know what, I'm gonna tell you, I'm damn near 30 years. It's that little 2% hope that maybe she left and started a new life and ran away from him. Just 2%, because I knew already that nigga killed her.
She Has a Name is a TMI and APM Studios production. Our team includes executive producer Antonio Wiley, showrunner Nicole Hill, audio producer and sound designer Marie Mendoza, and research producer Kristen Fraser. Our music was composed by Andy Clausen, sound design and final mastering by Enrico Benjamin. APM's executive producer is Erica Kraus. Senior production manager is Nick Ryan. And APM's executives in charge are Joanne Griffith and Chandra Kavadi. I'm your host, creator, and executive producer, Tonya Mosley. Special thanks to Sergeant Shannon Jones with Detroit Police, my admin, Rochelle Roberts, Melissa Kuipers at NPR West, and everyone willing to talk with us about this important story. This is for us.